But then, she's got all the time characters. And she's told by the words when the assault calls, assault charge.
Yeah, but it was on one of the podcasts I had this reference about
Right, folks, we're dropping behind time a bit, but that's good, excellent, because it means you're all chatting and talking. We can do that over lunch as well, because lunch, as I say, will be served in one of these rooms, if we can find it. We will, smell our way. So I'm going to start my little presentation. Forgive me one thing. I wrote some of this. I made a presentation at Fakenham a couple of years ago, and it was in two parts. And one part was looking at certain aspects of who was involved, and the second part was dealing with the other section of who may have been involved. So I've adapted this because I believe that the Mafia, and particularly Jack Ruby, was involved. The two were closely tied up, and Hoover was completely wrong, and the Warren Commission was completely wrong to say that Ruby was just a nut who happened to have been coming in off the street, and he shot this poor guy Oswald, and he had nothing to do with the Mafia. So I'm going to go through this and see how it turns out anyway.
Cantor's book is great.
First of all, I'm going to go through the cast of characters, and then we'll consider these are characters that I'm sure you have all recognised and read about. How and why some of them may have been involved in the assassination itself. Evidence of their involvement. I've said logic there because it was going really back to what Paul was saying. No, in fact it was you and your husband, I think it was, Jean, that if a set of circumstances occurs, and let's say Jean's husband was out for 1 hour, she may not know that he was at the pub, but it's quite likely that he was at the pub. And I think it's like that with JFK. Circumstances can occur, and we can imply that other situations took place afterwards. And then how Jack Ruby fits into the picture in particular, and the involvement of the Dallas Police Department, because Ruby, as you all well know, was very closely allied to the police, both before and at the time of the assassination. If you read an excellent book by Twyman, which is Bloody Treason, he goes into how this all started, and it's something which I've thought a lot about and tried to read a lot about. And his ideas are these: that there was a committee of patriots who sat at a desk one day and said, we've got to get rid of this guy. And it might only have been 2 or 3 people. Who were those people? When did they start the disinformation process, which is pre-execution? I believe that there was a group of maybe 2 or 3 who actually started planning right down to the idea of having a patsy, of what they might do to sheep dip that patsy, and the planning process was actually much more detailed. It must have been, because these guys knew that if they failed, they would be in the electric chair probably within the month. So they planned this down to the last detail. Then there was the execution, and I'm going to look at the groups of people who may have been involved in these different parts. And this is how Twyman breaks it up in Bloody Treason. And then finally, when might the committee have actually called upon the Mafia to help them in their task? And I've sort of thought fairly long time about that as well, as to when they might have been involved, because the Mafia were renowned in letting things leak, so I'm quite certain that they wouldn't have been right at the beginning. So, first of all, the least likely suspects. I'll just go through these. For those of you, I'm sure most of you know these. William Greer, the Secret Service with a pistol. If you look at the Zapruder film, there is a glint. I think it's probably on Greer's head, and it looks as if he's coming round with a pistol, and he shoots Kennedy.
There's another one now, Stuart, on Facebook, and it's the First Lady's got a gun.
Oh yes, yeah, I'm coming on to that, yes. And George Hickey, this is the famous one with Menninger, Mortal Error, if you've read it. This was on television about 2 years ago. A friend of
It's
mine.
the only one on the show now.
It's what?
The only documentary that ever
That
gets
ever
shown
showed
about
it.
this.
Yeah, a friend of mine was coming up and said,
again.
it's sold. And I said, no, it pretty well isn't. And I believe that Hickey, in fact, if you look at Ken O'Donnell's report and David Power's report, they said he did not fire his rifle. And the Zapruder film, if you look carefully, I don't think he's even raising the rifle until they're going under the underpass. So it's a load of bunk.
Yeah, well, that was faked.
Groden shows a photo actually of Hickey with the rifle already raised and Kennedy holding his throat.
So
yeah,
I know, but it was the fatal shot that he purported.
Yeah, but the point is that the fatal shot, according to the Smoking Gun documentary in Menninger, is supposed to have occurred as Hickey raised the rifle.
That's true,
But
yes,
in this photo that Groden shows,
it's
the rifle is
right
already upright,
yes.
and Kennedy is holding his throat, and his head is still intact.
Intact, yes.
So all I'm saying is that there's photographic evidence that refutes it. Forgive me.
As Pete said, Jackie Kennedy has been accused because of her husband's philandering. It was felt that that her husband should be shot or killed in public, which is perhaps far more likely to be the Mafia in that situation than poor old Jackie. And the last one is the Comité Gosudastre, I'm sure Jean can pronounce that, which is effectively the KGB. I don't think it could have been the KGB because Khrushchev and Kennedy were getting, by the time of the assassination, they were getting on fine together and forming an association where I think they would have gone on, and probably the Cold War would have finished many, many years earlier than it did. And then we have the case of Richard Case Nagel, where he went into the bank and shot into the air. He was concerned because it is believed that he was paid by the KGB to shoot Oswald because they had heard that Oswald was going to shoot Kennedy and they might be blamed. So
That's very convoluted.
that was the idea behind it anyway.
No Colonel Mustard.
In the library.
Candlestick.
With a candlestick.
Well, always the candlestick.
Yeah.
In the library with a small...
Everybody should have a candlestick.
So the suspects, this is the list as I put it anyway. Lee Harvey Oswald, Poisson, the Mafia and organised crime, the Central Intelligence Agency or rogue elements thereof. The Federal Bureau of Investigation may well have been involved, and certainly perhaps not in the actual shooting, maybe not even in the planning, but certainly in the cover-up. The Secret Service and Dallas Police, I believe, were definitely involved, or elements of them. The military-industrial complex, we were warned by Eisenhower at the time that he left the presidency, it was the sort of monetary relationships between the legislators and the national armed forces and the military-industrial base that were coming to power, and billions of pounds rested on this, and it could well be that we had an involvement there. The anti-Castro Cubans, of course, we know about the Texas oilmen, loads of money, the fact that Kennedy was going to get rid of the oil depletion allowance, and they were going to lose loads of money over that. Why it was ever introduced, I'm not sure. And then the extreme right-wing community, people like the John Birch Society. Who was it that produced the Wanted for Treason?
They were the Wiseman.
Who was that? Wiseman, that's it. And then of course there was General Walker, who was upset that he'd been sacked by Kennedy. A lot of extreme feeling on the right wing. And then I think Lyndon Baines Johnson. I didn't believe this to begin with until I read the book, in particular this one, which I do recommend to you. It's Bits, Betrayal in Dallas by Mark North. And a lot of what I'm talking about today is based on what Mark North says.
I've heard some people say that while LBJ may have known about the plot, or a plot,
Yes.
that he wasn't really likely to raise the alarm ahead of time. He may not have had any active
He may not have been a planner. He certainly didn't start it.
He wasn't a planner or
So all these people were brought in, going back to how Twyman looked at this, they were brought in on a need-to-know basis because it couldn't be leaked out. So we're looking at the planning. I think we could have had those guys involved. The right-wing extremists, because they were fairly senior in the government, or had been. The military-industrial complex, billions of pounds rested on this. The Texas oil men, again, money was talking. They could have provided funding, and there was it was reckoned that £10 million in dollars in those days would have been required to plan this. And then the Central Intelligence Agency, the Mafia, I think, on really looking at this, were looking at it totally differently from these other guys. I think the Mafia was planning something themselves. And you've only got to look at Marcello and how he was beginning to hate Kennedy and what he was saying to his sidekicks, which we'll come on to in a minute. I think they could have been planning things separately, and they were pulled in by who I'm calling the planners later on in the day.
Quite about the tail of the dog.
That's right, yes, yeah, exactly, yes, yeah. Linda Bain Johnson, I think afterwards in the planning process, they knew Johnson was definitely going to become president, and they knew that he was going to have to be pulled in to help with the cover-up, if nothing else.
What about the Yarborough testimony of LBJ travelling down Euston Street, all hunched down,
Yes.
and also
Well, he was supposed to be
and
filming
also
his
telling the
radio,
lie
wasn't he?
about his Secret Service
Yes,
agent
yes. And
jumping
Youngblood-
over the scene.
Youngblood didn't actually do it.
No.
Yeah, you're right.
That's
yeah.
weird.
Yes,
And do we
it
know,
is.
Stuart, whether LBJ reversed the oil depletion allowance?
Good point. I don't know.
He, it was actually, oh God, who's the guy on the Warren Commission that I did a report on, because he was the one that changed it.
Oh,
Boggs.
big,
Yarborough? No.
no.
Boggs?
Boggs, yeah.
Boggs.
It was Boggs that eventually, during LBJ, got it amended. So
So there was a payoff of sorts when in due course.
no, the opposite.
It's the opposite.
Ah,
It was the
right.
opposite, actually.
They were losing
so,
money.
So you can't blame, you can't say that about LBJ. On the contrary, the Democrats were generally trying to, even though LBJ was, into oil and all the rest of it, but it was Boggs that eventually brought down the level. Yeah.
But even today, they still get the oil
They
companies
do,
get
yeah.
massive
Oh yeah,
tax
yeah,
breaks.
yeah. I mean, he
Massive.
wasn't able to overturn it, but he was actually able to reduce it.
Yes.
So about funding, I read something about the Federal Reserve,
Yes.
Oh yeah.
about it was Executive Order 1110. It was on about, Ken was thinking about cutting, because they basically control the money supply for the US government, and he was like, well,
Yeah.
why don't we print, as we used to, print our
Right.
own,
Back by silver.
the government money? Why do we
Need to.
let them essentially borrow money off a private institution?
And charge us commission for that.
Yeah.
Right, so this is the disinformation section. This is when they started to set up the patsy. This is when they started to prepare for the actual execution, all the information that they had to put out generally. I think the Secret Service could well have been involved at that time. They were certainly involved in setting up the route, and I think there was a lot of problems going in the White House, where people were arguing as to what route should be used and whether it was a good idea to turn into Elm Street. And I think there could have been quite a bit of input from the Secret Service at this point. Certainly the Central Intelligence Agency, they were helping to set a patsy up. or probably maybe involved with Mongoose and maybe involved with anti-Castro Cuban plots, and a lot of people believe that it was an anti-Castro Cuban plot, which then became a plot against Kennedy's life. The Dallas police, certainly at this stage, at a fairly senior level, and I think they were going to be involved at that stage, preparing, if you like, for the execution and what the rogue elements of the Dallas police were going to have to do. Lyndon Baines Johnson would certainly have been involved by now. He was going to have to take over at the point of the assassination, and he was in his own mind, I'm sure, planning that. And then anti-Castro Cubans, their ties to the CIA, Carlos Marcello and Jack Ruby, and that's the first time that we've mentioned Ruby, and I'm certain that he was brought in, but under pain of death. He was not going to be allowed to say anything. The execution itself, anti-Castro Cubans, I think there's a list later on which I'll show you very briefly, and the actual people who may have been involved, the rogue elements of the CIA setting it up, the Secret Service. Again, you look at the car itself, some people believe that there was this delay by Greer, that he turned round and delayed it purposely so that the shots could be put in. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that, but the drinking the night before, the fact that they were stood down.
You've got the incident at the airport where they just come in and
Yeah,
the guy
absolutely.
is trying
And
he
he
goes,
pulls them back.
and he
Yeah,
goes,
yeah. I mean, he was such a suspicious character, that guy.
I can't remember which agent it was, but he
And
pulls him off and he goes,
And the destruction of the evidence in the limousine and the
Yes,
destruction
this
of
is after the
the
execution.
windshield,
Absolutely, yes,
the
absolutely.
whole limousine rebuild.
You see them actually cleaning the car, don't you, with a mop
Yeah.
and brush. Yeah,
Crime scene.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
crime scene.
some crime scene. And the Mafia, Jack Ruby is a member of the Mafia, part of which he becomes subservient, they become subservient to the CIA. The cover, the post-execution, well, you name it. It's going on to this very day. So I'm sure you could add at least another 10 headings to that cover-up. So, the lineup, the principal characters. This guy, Carlos Marcello, he was, I think, the sort of boss of bosses in the Mafia. He was probably the head man in the planning. There were times when the guy was going absolutely spare when people spoke to him about Kennedy, and the fact we'll get to know a little bit more about what both RFK and JFK were doing to the Mafia, and I can quite understand how they were beginning to hate him. And then we had Santo Trafficante. This probably was a guy who, I think he was the worst. And there's a list of parts of the organisation, the whole structure of the USA, where he was involved, and he was absolutely, money meant everything to him, and he would do anything. He would murder, he would kill, he would bribe. And I think Carlos Marcello and he probably had a fairly good go at the planning and also later on with the execution. Sam Giancana, he was another mobster. He was the Chicago outfit. Some people believe that he wasn't involved, but he certainly was pretty pissed off. Because if you remember, he actually paid he paid out money to get Kennedy elected through Kennedy's dad, and the fact that they then came after the Mafia afterwards, I think they were...
So I think rightly, reason to be annoyed.
Yeah, exactly, yes. Well, at one point though, I hadn't realised that, Yes, well, I haven't mentioned the fact that Giancana and JFK, of course, shared a mistress who was Judith Exner. She admitted that she carried envelopes from JFK to Giancana and Roselli, who we'll come on to in a minute, and that Giancana actually met JFK at the White House to do the Operation Mongoose business.
What if she, I know apparently there's no evidence of it, what if she'd given them both VD?
Yes, yeah.
I know of injection of penicillin and one.
He died frying sausages, didn't he, in his basement?
He did,
With
exactly.
bullets around the mouth.
He did, yes, he did, and that was a sign.
Just
of,
before he was going to the
Give evidence.
HSCA.
Yeah, the guy in the dustbin.
Johnny Roselli, he always looked such a cheerful character. But you've got to remember that these four guys would not have gone to the position they had unless they had committed several murders. And it's hard to believe. But he was very cooperative. In fact, he was known as Captain something down when he was down in New Orleans, not New Orleans, down in working on Operation Mongoose on JM Wave. He was known as, they thought he was in the services. He was so regularly down at the CIA station down there that he became almost part of the furniture. And then this guy, he was James Middelhofer. He was the head of the Teamsters Union. And I'm going to play a little tract later on, just showing how this guy responded to RFK, dear old Robert Kennedy. Robert Kennedy, I think this was the guy he wanted to get. This was the guy who was providing loads of money. He was funding the Mafia, just about every arm, and he formed this Get Hoffa squad. Which was a team of investigators who were trying to get Hoffa. So these gangsters had influence over virtually the whole of the United States. Then close to home, this is where I started to learn a little bit. And this guy, Joseph Civello, who was head of the Dallas Mafia. I always thought he was fairly laid back and he wasn't particularly involved. And he was, if we look at a little bit about him, he came up through the mob. He was appointed as head of the Mafia in the Dallas area. And he controlled all the rackets. But I don't believe that the police were particularly worried about the guy, and certainly his sidekick, this smiling guy here, Joseph Campisi. Joseph comes up quite a bit in this talk, by the way. It's not a name I particularly wanted at that time. But this guy looks fantastic. He owned the restaurant, restaurant where Jack Ruby went the night before. The Egyptian Lounge, no doubt anybody who's been to Dallas would have been to Campisi's. It's still there. It's actually called the Egyptian Lounge. But he was actually heavily involved as well, and I'll come on to a little bit more in that involvement and why the Kennedys were so alarmed that these guys existed. Then we have Lewis McWillie. He was described by the DPD as a gambler and murderer. He owned the Tropicana Hotel in Havana and was forced out of Cuba at the time Batista fell and Castro came in. He was a very close friend of Ruby and actually paid for a holiday for Ruby in Havana. But obviously this guy was one of the mobsters who wanted to get back into Cuba at all costs. It cost him a lot of money. Then we have Frank Costello, who was a friend of J. Edgar Hoover. He used to fix track faces for the FBI chief over many years, and along with other mafia chiefs as well. But they had him compromised. They knew, well, some people believe that he wasn't a homosexual, but there was a lot of evidence to say that he was, and his partner Tolson So it was a little bit of, well, if you tell, we'll tell as well. And I think they had Costello had Hoover over Bowell. Jacob Rubinstein, we'll certainly be talking a bit more about him. That's how he liked to be remembered, at the top there with his girls, sitting with his feet up quite often in his carousel club. And then the photo below is just before you can see him coming out. I don't think Oswald has even realised that he was going to be shot at that point, but he's coming out in his fedora hat there, about to do the dirty deed. And then just a little bit about the Dallas Police Department as well. I think this was an unholy alliance which started in about 1948, and this is the bit that I'm sure you've all remembered how LBJ came up, and he was at every stage he was cheating and climbing the ladder by devious means. The Dallasites at the time, back in 48, 49, believed that he epitomised the lowest level in character and intelligence. So although he was a Texas guy, he was not, the Dallas Morning News certainly didn't think very much of him. He sought support though in Dallas, and this is the club that I hadn't heard about, the Anonymous Club. Which was run by Joe Civello. It sounded fantastic. They used to meet every week or 2 weeks, 26 of them, sit around a table and plan everything that was going on, and money would change hands, illegal gambling, setting up who was going to be murdered next. And LBJ was actually introduced to Civello and attended these meetings in Dallas, which was an eye-opener to me. Box 13 scandal, this was the one where, if you remember, the 200 votes were suddenly found and plucked out of the air, and Coke Stevenson, who should have won the Senate seat at that time, was consigned to oblivion, really. And he got away with it, because by this time he was bribing loads of people, and I'm quite certain Hoover, who lived opposite him, or almost next to him, would have helped him if it had been necessary. LBJ actually sought an increasing number of aliens allowed into the military, and the reason was they would then be safe against the INS trying to get them out of the country. One of them, who we will mention briefly later on as well, was this guy Joe Yanni. I think it's pronounced, Jean may know more about that guy, but this LBJ simply said, right, we'll allow these guys into the military, and therefore INS, sorry, you can't get rid of them because they're now working for the government. Sarah Hughes, Judge Sarah Hughes, this was the lady who of course swore, LBJ insisted that she'd be present at his swearing in. And Henry Wade, of course we all know Henry Wade because he was around the time after the assassination and when Oswald was being arraigned and so on. But these guys were totally corrupt to the core, and if you read this book, I really do think that it's worth a read to realise what these people were doing, both Hughes and Wade. The Civello, this is the Pearl Street Mafia, they called themselves in the end. They relied on Wade at every turn. If anyone was arraigned for a crime, Wade would make sure that they got off, or Hughes would make sure that the sentence they got was a very lenient one. Ruby came to Dallas from Chicago and immediately realised that if he was going to make anything of himself, he'd have to join the Mafia or be associated with them. The Dallas Police Department, it's reported they were powerless. They would arrest people, and 2 days later these guys were out on the street again. So the Dallas Police Department tried their